Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Marcela Liscano, soy la directora de Ocolabs y en nombre de todo el equipo quiero darles las gracias por estar aquí en estos días difíciles. También son difíciles para nosotras, pero si bien es difícil hacer algo, es más importante no parar y seguir haciendo lo que creemos que puede construir un cambio. Entonces, en ese sentido, nos alegra mucho que estén acá, que estemos todos juntos hoy como para reflexionar cuáles son esas estrategias para lograr que las películas o el hacer que cada uno tenga logre llegar más allá e impactar realmente a la sociedad. Voy a ser muy breve, quiero, bueno, agradecer este espacio también en nombre de Docolabs, también el apoyo de Deutsche Welle Academy, de Doc Society y de mis colegas increíbles que están acá conmigo. Vanessa Cuervo, que es una de ellas, mi coequipera en este proyecto, va a estar acá guiando esta conversación. Ella les va a presentar a Anthony, les va a contar un poco más cuál va a ser la dinámica de esto. Entonces, nada, bienvenidos a este espacio que esperamos se repita con frecuencia y que podamos con Docolabs y Acción seguir creciendo en este camino de la producción de impacto en Colombia. Entonces, que tengan todos una buena clase. Vane, te dejo la palabra.
Gracias, Marce. Bueno, buenas tardes. Yo soy Vanessa Cuervo. Para quienes se vuelven a conectar a este espacio, gracias por volver. Para quienes no lograron llegar al primero, pero ahora están acá, gracias por unirse. Bienvenidas todas, todos y todes a esta segunda clase magistral del impacto a la acción. Recuerden que este es un evento bilingüe y nuestro invitado de hoy estará hablando en inglés, entonces para que puedan escuchar en español, por favor activen el icono en la barra de Zoom abajo de interpretación, eligiendo el idioma español. Ahí estarán entonces asegurándose de que van a estar escuchando la traducción. Y bueno, si en el encuentro pasado ya estábamos revueltas, hoy pues francamente me cuesta abrir este espacio con el alma tan rota. Yo creo que no hace falta hacer un recuento de los tiempos que vivimos, pues creo que estamos todas atravesadas por este estallido social en Colombia. Y en tiempos de crisis y de duelo colectivo, yo suelo encontrar algo de consuelo en el arte, en la poesía y en poder imaginar otros mundos posibles. Entonces hoy, cuando estaba así como encontrando las fuerzas para levantarme, ¿no? Como revolviendo las tripas, me llegaron dos poemas cortos que quiero compartir con ustedes. El primero se llama Multicoloridad y lo escribió una colega, una mujer de Chiapas, feminista, indígena, realizadora de cine e investigadora. Concepción Suárez es su nombre. Y su poema es Multicoloridad. De la tierra decidieron mezclarse. Los abuelos y abuelas vinieron en sus espíritus, y no todos eran morenos. Prendieron luces nuevas y poco a poco nos enseñaron a mirar, más profundo que la piel. Ahí reposa un sueño antiguo que no tiene idioma. Quienes entendieron se hablaron. Los colores en caracol giran el universo. Ese es el primer poema que quería compartir con ustedes, y el segundo se llama La cabeza, y este lo escribió Freddy Chicangana, que es un indígena de la comunidad yanacona del Cauca. La cabeza. Y desde la madre tierra habló. No hemos muerto, dijo una cabeza. Estamos en el silencio de las estrellas, en el cielo azul y las nubes rojizas, en el silencio de la noche, en la pluma que habla sobre el agua, en la cascada que golpea la piedra. Estamos como ayer en lucha interminable. Y bueno, ojalá estas palabras también les sirvan a ustedes para enraizarnos un poco en este momento, pues mientras navegamos por este tiempo que yo siento como de profunda incertidumbre, creo que nuestra contribución como artistas, narradores, creadores de historias significa algo y tiene un lugar, ¿no? Nuestro trabajo está entretejido entre los movimientos sociales y culturales y puede que ahora no sepamos exactamente cómo nuestra labor va a catalizar la transformación a corto plazo, pero desde cada esquina somos necesarias para la transformación y tenemos la oportunidad de construir nuevos imaginarios, nuevas prácticas que vayan como allanando el camino hacia nuevos sistemas. Entonces esperamos que espacios como este, pues que de aquí germinen ideas, inspiración, nuevas formas de resistencia y también de transformación. Hoy las y los invitamos a participar a través del chat y también a través del icono de preguntas. Cuando tengan alguna duda, alguna pregunta, pueden dejarla ahí. Y habiendo dicho todo esto, le quiero dar la bienvenida ahora a nuestro invitado especial de hoy, mi colega y amigo Anthony Truong Swan, quien se conecta desde Canadá. Anthony ha trabajado con documentales sobre justicia social y sobre medio ambiente. Ha sido un gran puente y conector para poner estas películas en el centro de las agendas públicas. Ha sido productor de impacto para documentales como The World is Bright, Conviction, First We Eat y Food for the Rest of Us. Y es sobre las campañas de algunas de estas películas que nos va a compartir hoy, con ejemplos reales de cómo adaptar una estrategia de impacto a un público, a una región, cómo incorporar socios, la importancia también de colaborar éticamente con las comunidades afectadas por algunas de estas problemáticas, y cómo evaluar si lo que estamos haciendo está siendo realmente efectivo. Así que bueno, así como he visto a Rosana bailar samba con pasión, a Anthony lo he escuchado cantar apasionadamente en un karaoke cuando celebramos los triunfos de algunos de estos proyectos. Así que me complace mucho darte la bienvenida. Welcome, friend.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I'm really honored to be here, speaking to all of you about something that I care deeply about. I'm just going to quickly introduce myself before we get into the presentation. My name is Anthony Truong Swan. I'm grateful to the entire DOCO team for putting this event together, including, Vanessa, Tati, Nani, Juan Caño, who's running this event from behind the scenes, and Leonardo, who's translating this for those of you who are listening in Spanish. I am a person of many joys and great hope, and I say that because I am a poverty survivor. My parents were refugees, and I grew up in a housing project in Canada, one of the oldest housing projects in North America. And so I've witnessed quite a lot of injustice and despair in my life. And the thing that has always gotten me through those moments, or the thing that has best served me in getting through those moments, is hope that I can have some part in making things better for myself and for my loved ones. And as I've built this career as an impact producer, as someone who uses these beautiful stories, one of the most powerful tools that human beings have to change other people's minds and change other people's behaviors, that hope has always stayed with me. So I guess what I want to say is I want to acknowledge what's happening in Colombia right now. And I want you to know that I and all the Canadians on my team stand in solidarity against the violence that's happening there. And I wish you all safety and stamina, but more than anything, I wish you all hope. Hope that you can see a better future, not too far away, that you all have a place in that future, and that you have a part in building it. And I hope that I can do my part today in sharing some of the knowledge that I have in hopes that it will be helpful for you. So I just want to quickly say that so you get to know me. One thing that we do in Canada, or that at least my organization does in Canada, is before every event, we acknowledge the territory of the people whose land we are on once belonged to acknowledge that the settlers in Canada stole it from them. And I think we do that also because we hope that one day everyone will understand the history of our country and the people that still live on this land. So I would like to acknowledge that right now I am in Toronto, Canada, the place called Toronto. That is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and all the indigenous peoples that have passed through this land in the past. And I want to share that practice with you because I know that colonialism is something I would hope that we all fight against and continue to fight against the effects of. So if it is helpful, I'm going to share this website in the chat. It's something that I use very often. You just put where you are in it and it tells you whose traditional territory you're on. And I would love to know if any of you choose to use it. Thank you. So I'm going to hop right into my presentation. I am conscious that we have almost 100 of you in this workshop today, and I want to make sure that even though I'm speaking English and many of you are listening in Spanish, that I want you to feel comfortable asking questions because this is a complicated sector, this is a complicated business, and I am here, I am available to you, I want to answer your questions. So I do hope that you will share your questions, both in the Q&A section and in the chat. Vanessa, I hope you will feel very comfortable interrupting me. I love to be interrupted with questions. So I'm going to go ahead and start. So I am the outreach director for an organization called Story Money Impact. We are a charity in Canada that helps documentary films that are about urgent issues maximize their ability to create change. So I guess what I want to say is making a film, making a piece of media art isn't necessarily social change in and of itself. It's about the use of that piece of media art, the use of that tool, how you are deploying it to create a certain outcome that is impact producing. And what we do at Story Money Impact is we specifically focus on creating partnerships between those very powerful stories about important issues with the nonprofits or the businesses or the philanthropists or the charities or the politicians that care about the same things that that film is about. And we believe that it is through those partnerships by all these different people with different skills and different contacts working together that we're able to create that change. So we want to support the films by bringing them these partnerships, but we're also supporting all of these partners by letting them use the film to support their important work. And we do that through all of this outreach and partnership building, but also through strategy building. So that's just a very quick summary of what Story Money Impact does in Canada. So one of our major programs is Good Pitch Vancouver. Many of you may already have heard of the Good Pitch program because there is a Good Pitch Mexico and a Good Pitch Latin America. It's an international program founded by this incredible organization, Doc Society. If you go to goodpitch.org, you can learn a lot more about it. But the idea behind Good Pitch is that documentaries can move hearts as well as minds, which is something that is almost unique to documentaries. When the credits on a powerful story begin to roll and the audience is sitting in their seats, some of them weeping, many of them choose to stand up and ask, what can I do now that I know about this issue? And impact producing at its core is about knowing who you want to show it to get that reaction, and when they have that reaction, what you want to ask them to do. And at Good Pitch, we believe that there are people who are scattered across different parts of society who care about the same thing and are working towards the same goals. A politician may, be voting in a certain way about a certain issue, and an academic may be studying that same issue, getting more data, and an NGO might be working to develop relationships in the community, and a philanthropist might be trying to fund projects to work in that issue. And we believe that documentary and Good Pitch can be a meeting place for all of them to come together, acknowledge the important work that each of them are doing in their own sector, and then work together, at least within the parameters of the film's impact campaign. It's a really beautiful thing. If you've ever had the privilege to go to one, you know that I'm not doing it justice with my words. You basically have a room full of incredibly powerful people in their own right who have been encountering so many challenges in their own work, seeing that everyone else in the room agrees with them, and everyone leans in, listens to a film's a pitch about the change that they can make in the world with their help, and everyone makes a pledge. And with those pledges, a politician might offer to make some introductions, a educator might offer to design some lesson plans, a foundation may offer money. We take all of those pledges and then we try to build an impact campaign out of it. And at Good Pitch, we've supported 10 films so far, and we have a short video that's going to show you what some of those films have accomplished in the past 2 years. So Juan Camille, could you please play the video from Good Pitch Vancouver?
The evidence shows that we have left the Holocene and entered the Anthropocene epoch. Because humans now change the Earth and its systems more than all natural processes combined. We are all implicated, some far more profoundly than others. But the tenacity and ingenuity that helped us thrive can also help us to pull these systems back to a safe place for all life on Earth.
You guys could go in tomorrow morning. When you guys walk through this line, one-way ticket, you get on the chopper and you get out of Topet.
Shimin's story could have been different if the Canadian Border Service Agency and Immigration Canada had understood how to better deal with mental illness.
I was asked to collaborate on The World is Bright, so I will be rolling up my sleeves, thinking of interested parties who would like to be connected to this film with the intent to improve the sensitivity of authorities when they greet these young people.
More than half of the women who are in prison are racialized women. Many of them have experienced horrific violence as children and as adults.
We pay about $100,000 a year to house each woman in provincial prison, and we believe that conviction can be a catalyst for change.
Thank you. So, you know, that video really gets me every time. One thing I really want everyone to understand clearly is, you know, when you watch these case studies, these videos about all the great amount of change that a impact campaign has created, I think it's important not to feel intimidated. I think it's important to acknowledge that an impact campaign is not just the filmmaker or the impact producer. It's all of the partners that have been brought to the table too. It's about how we can all work together instead of each working separately to try and achieve the same goals. So to use an example, in the video you just watched, Conviction, which was the film about people being imprisoned in Canada and the rising rates of imprisonment. You know, the Senator Elizabeth Fry, the Senator Kim Pate was already drafting those bills on creating judicial discretion and eliminating criminal records before she became a part of that impact campaign. But by being a part of the impact campaign, we were able to mobilize so many more of her constituents and other Canadians who cared about this issue to support those bills than she would have had otherwise. So it's all about finding people and using the film as a way to bring people together, to educate them and to mobilize them to do something together. So as we go through this, I do hope that you realize that you can be a part of this change too. So I'm going to talk about a few other programs before I get into the nitty-gritty of it. Story Money Impact does something called the Pod. In Canada, impact producing is very new. I don't know what the state of it is like for you, but we have only a few Canadian impact production companies and only a handful of impact producers. We have less than like 15. And as Story Money Impact continues to hold these good pitch events, and as more and more impact campaigns pop up for documentary films in Canada, we saw a need to build up the sector, to create more impact producers, to create more relationships between impact producers and funders. And so we're building this sector. And so we started a paid impact producer training program called the SMI Pod. And these 5 people, after an impact curriculum, they have continued support from SMI to design workshops to teach filmmakers like you how to create impact, to design case studies for Canadian impact films so that people understand the work that we're trying to do. And a few of them are actually impact producing a few projects themselves, and we're very proud of them. And I want to talk a little bit about the films that we've supported at SMI. So you'll see here a few screenshots of the films that we've supported. Since 2018, we've supported 12 different films through tentpole programs like Good Pitch Vancouver, through impact producing ourselves, and through consultation on impact strategy. And we're really proud to have supported films about environmental justice, Indigenous land defense, food justice, technology and labor, racism, incarceration, and mental health. And if you're interested in learning more about any of these films, I'm just going to put a quick link in the chat. And so you can kind of take a look at that later. But yes, we're going to talk about a few of those films today. So the film I really want to focus on is a film called The World is Bright. This is going to be our case study today. This is going to be the film that I'm going to keep referring back to over and over again because I was the impact producer for this campaign. And it's a film about how migration has an effect on mental health. It creates all sorts of stressors that don't otherwise exist. And it sometimes compounds hereditary mental illness symptoms. In this story in particular, a young man immigrates to Canada. He experiences mental illness while he's studying here, and then he dies by suicide. And the film follows his two parents who, when they hear about his death by suicide, they have such a limited understanding about mental health. They've never talked about it. It's a very taboo subject, that they don't believe he killed himself. They immigrate to Canada to investigate his death as if he was murdered. And while they're in Canada, they experience the same things that he experienced: the social isolation, the culture shock, the racist bureaucracy, and antagonistic institutions that don't really want to cooperate with someone who can't speak their language. And finally, after 10 years in Canada, they start experiencing their own mental health challenges. They get depressed and they start having suicidal thoughts. And it's then that they realize, this is what my son went through. This is what mental illness, what mental health challenges really mean. And they finally understood what their son went through and they decided to return home. It's a beautiful film. I'd love for you to just get a quick taste of it. Juan Camilo, could you please play the trailer for us?
每次打他都说：“妈，你放心，我很好。”
国际刑警给我们打了一个电话，电话说你孩子在加拿大驻地遇害，警方正在调查，你们等待警方调查结果。
他们通知了，说已经下葬了。
已经下葬了5天。我收到加拿大寄出的遗物里头有2张银行的取款单据，一张是他死亡当天，2天以后也是取款记录。 我们觉得非常可疑，非常可疑。
他总感到有人在跟踪他，要害他。
Can you speak Chinese？ 慢慢越来越深，我就觉得问题越多。
This case was an eye-opener in terms of what went wrong.
Well, now the federal court has decided to review how the case was handled.
我们一个老百姓，而且是外国的一个老百姓，要跟加拿大政府这个打官司。我们合一天就要为这个权利争取一点，斗争一点。
觉得这个路就是好，不容易往下走。
他当初来的时候没想待这么久。我最怕的现在就是怕我的家人知道他们的孙子没了，就希望孩子出去以后都觉得会获得很大的收获。
在小苗他们自家好的话，身体这些
那么成高兴。
我是懦夫，
孩子的名字是我取的，
我是怪人，
名字叫邓世明。
我为什么在这里？
世界的世，光明的明。
I don't belong here. I don't belong here.
A really beautiful trailer and an incredibly beautiful film. So when we first saw this film, you know what, I'm going to save that for later. So I'm going to talk about The World is Bright and use it as a case study as we go through the major phases of an impact campaign. So we're going to talk about strategy building. How did we build a strategy for this film? And then once we built the strategy, how did we start building partnerships? What does that involve? What does that look like? What were the challenges? And then we're going to talk a little bit about fundraising, because that's different everywhere. And then the big part is execution. How do you execute an impact campaign? And then evaluation. And every time we talk about each of those specific phases, I'm going to go back to the world is bright and say, this is what we did. So you can see how I did it, because there is no one size fits all impact strategy. There's no way to just get something off the shelf and just apply it to every film. Every film is different because it's about different issues. Every issue has different opponents, different places in the cultural conversation. And instead of giving you the theory, which many of you have already learned in the previous masterclass and workshop, I'm going to show you my challenges and how our team chose to creatively solve them. In addition to The World is Bright, I also want to use examples from a film called Conviction. Conviction is a very different type of film. And it's had very different types of support, very different partnerships and very different challenges. Conviction, again, is a film about the rising rate of incarcerated women worldwide and asks prisoners, what did you need to not end up in prison? Because their voices are so often ignored. And what is revealed through their answers is that we actually live in a society where there aren't many social supports for poor people. And prisons, in a lot of ways, are just used as warehouses for poor people who have no other social programs to go to. And the film follows this group of incarcerated women as they're in prison, as they're released from prison, and when they return to prison. And so I'm going to be using some examples from this film as well. So let's hop right into it. One of the most important things when you start designing an impact campaign is just to think about, is to really understand what the film is about. And I know that sounds really obvious, but you'd be surprised how often an impact producer and a filmmaker can disagree about what the key issues of the film are. And I think, for example, The World is Bright. The World is Bright is about this young man. He immigrated to Canada. He had mental health issues. I've told you all of that. Part of the story is that he was ordered to be deported from Canada back to China right before he committed suicide. And we thought that was a really important part of the impact campaign at first. The state of immigration law in Canada and the way that immigrants often have their court orders just rubber stamped by people who don't understand what they're saying or their defenses. We were also talked a little bit about the fact that the young man in the film was assaulted by Canadian Border Service Agency officers. They're basically border police in Canada. And we thought that that was something that was really important for us to address as well. So sitting down with your filmmaker and just talking, it's like, what is this film about? What really made you furious about the state of the world? What made you like really sad? And what do you think we can actually change? Understanding that film, the key issues of your film and what audiences are actually getting out of it are really important, because the filmmaker often has the messages that they want to say to the audience, but you should be building your impact campaign off of what the audience hears when they watch the film. And once you have that understanding, that's when you kind of start talking about, well, if that's what the film is saying, if that's what audiences are hearing, then what are the goals of the impact campaign? What should we be trying to change? And so, as I said, in The World is Bright, we identified that we wanted to raise awareness and stimulate conversations surrounding mental health and wellness among immigrant populations, specifically Chinese immigrants. We wanted to reform the Canadian Border Services Agency. We wanted to create an in-house mental health authority and an oversight body for resolving complaints at the Border Police Agency. And then finally, we also were calling for the Immigration and Refugee Act to be rewritten in support of reform so that hearing procedures and deportation thresholds are more sensitive to immigrants who have mental illness vulnerabilities. So that was those were the goals that we developed after we watched the film with a few people and asked them what really affected them from the film. In comparison with Conviction, we showed that film to a number of people. We asked them what they thought, and it turns out that many people just didn't know how much prisons cost. So that was something that we really wanted to do. Because audiences thought that, we thought, okay, we want to educate the public about the cost of prisons and how ineffective they are. Right? It turns out a lot of the issues that we were talking about, people didn't know the exact details. We wanted to mobilize people to change government policy, to eliminate mandatory sentencing and to stop building new prisons, to reduce the number of people entering prisons. And then we also called for all the funding that goes into prisons to go into community-based social support networks. So, basic income, childcare, addictions counseling services. So that was some of the thinking that we started doing. And once you have those goals, I want to bring your attention to how specific they are. Because the more specific your goals are, the easier it is to figure out exactly who you need to go to. Because one problem I see come up a lot is that filmmakers or really early career impact producers will say, I want to raise awareness. And raising awareness is great, but how is the issue changed by raising the awareness? Once people know, what are you asking them to do? Or, we want to create food sovereignty. Anyway, there's so many examples, but I will end on be specific about your goals. That's very helpful. So many of you have seen this matrix before, and I'll just quickly go over it for those of you who are new to it. This really helps determine where your film falls in terms of what sort of strategy are we choosing to use. If it's an unknown issue that doesn't have a lot of opposition, then simply by revealing it, by letting people know about it, some sort of big change happens. If it's an unknown issue with a lot of strong opposition, there are going to be people who push back. You want to investigate, you want to show all the details, all the the evidence, all the things that are going to prevent your opposition from squashing your campaign. If it's a very known issue, people have already made up their minds about it, right? But if there's not a lot of opposition, then all you have to do is just find a way to bring the public attention back to that issue for this moment and ask them to do something. If it's a very known issue, so people already have very strong opinions on which side they fall on, and there's very strong opposition, and there will be people fighting you every step of the way, then sometimes the best strategy is simply to humanize the protagonists of the film, the subjects of the film, so that people don't see it as this issue, but rather the human beings that the issue affects. But the problem I find with using this matrix is that one film can fall into multiple categories. And it really depends on which issue in that film you really want to focus your campaign on, because reality is complex. Issues are complex. Oftentimes an impact film is about all of these different issues that intersect and intertwine and make things so complicated and hard to change. And I think acknowledging that complexity is really important too, because you're not going to be able to do everything. In fact, my interpretation of impact producing is that you should not be doing everything. There are people who are better at doing certain things than others. You should be working together. So figuring out where issues fall in this matrix is important to me too. So for example, mental health and immigrants, the world is bright. One of our first goals was simply to get immigrants talking about mental health, particularly Chinese immigrants. And this was an issue I had a lot of insight on because I am a Vietnamese Chinese refugee, child of refugees myself. And I knew that it's an incredibly taboo topic. No one talks about it. If you even bring up mental health challenges, your parents, your aunties, your uncles, they just tell you to shut up and be quiet. They tell you to man up. They tell you that, you know, it's bad luck to talk about that stuff. They act like it's contagious, or they act like it's a personal failing. And so people never talk about their mental health challenges until, like in this film, it's too late and we lose someone that we love. And so when I look at that issue, I thought, you know, this film actually shows these two parents going through that journey, right? They didn't believe that they had to talk about mental health or understand mental health. And then they lost their son and they had to grieve for 10 years and experience it themselves before they finally understood. So I thought that simply by showing immigrants this film and showing them that understanding mental health can help them, it would be a reveal. We would just show them. It would be very easy to just show them why they needed to understand mental health. But the issue about how Shimeng was mistreated by the institutions in Canada, by the border police and by the mental health institution that didn't provide him with the help that he needed, or the courts that ordered for him to be deported. These are issues that aren't really talked about a lot in Canada, because in Canada, we believe that we're a very multicultural country. We're very proud of how many immigrants we have. And yet we have some of the very same problems that, you know, we criticize in the United States. We have border police who act with impunity. We have courts of law that are racist and have different standards for immigrants than they do for Canadian citizens. And so we knew that we would have a lot of opposition if we were going to try and change the border police or try and change the way that mental health institutions deal with immigrants. So that is something where we had to investigate a hidden issue and show the experience that Shimeng, the young man from the film, had with these institutions. So that falls under this category. And then of course, there's the idea of changing law. I think many of us love the idea of being able to like get in a room with a policymaker and say, you need to change this law. But, you know, in Canada, you know, immigration law is, you know, immigration is an issue that we talk about a lot, and people either believe that immigrants need to earn their place in our society, or people like me believe that we should have open borders and accept that immigrants bring so much to the cultural fabric of our society. And we had a lot of strong opposition. Changing law is never easy. You need to build grassroots community support, you need to build legislative support, and you need to have resources to continue those conversations for a long time. And so changing the law, our third impact goal, is of course a very entrenched issue. So knowing that, it gave us an idea of, okay, we can start building a strategy now that we know what the challenges are. And so we'll talk a little bit about strategy building and mapping the issue. Do we have any questions so far before I jump into this? I would love to hear a little bit from the audience. If I'm going too fast, if you want me to tap in a little bit on a specific topic, because I know that there are 100 of you out there, but I'm just looking at a computer monitor. So I'd really like to feel like I'm with all of you. Do we have any questions, Vanessa?
Sí, hay dos preguntas. Yes, there are two questions. One of them is, since filmmakers and impact producers can have differing opinions, what is your take on impact producers being someone from the production team? Are there more benefits when the impact producer is someone else solely focused on that role? That's the first one. And the second one is, how do you and Story Money Impact identify which films you want to get involved with?
That's a great question. Two very good questions. So with regards to impact producers and filmmakers, I want to first say that the most common model that emerges is that the director takes on the work of being the impact producer, because the director has spent years with the project, they understand issues, they've built some of the partnerships themselves, they have relationships with the subjects of the film. And I think if that is the case, it's important to acknowledge that impact producing is a very different skill set than filmmaking and storytelling. If the director or someone from the film team chooses to take on this work, they really have to switch gears and look at the material that's been created by organizations like Doc Society or DOCO or Story Money Impact or Good Films Incorporated, to think about impact in a specific way. Maybe I'm biased, but I always think that it's most beneficial for an impact producer to be specifically assigned to a film, because they can look at it with fresh eyes. They bring all of their expertise in how to execute pieces of strategy. What are the specific benefits is that, they have those fresh eyes, and, looking for funding to produce a film is very different than looking for funding to mount an impact campaign. In Canada, at least, impact campaigns are very new. So a lot of the work of being an impact producer in Canada is that you're looking for a foundation or a charity or a philanthropist who has a history of funding projects that are in the same issue environment as yours. And then you have to tell them what impact producing is, and then you have to convince them to get that, to come on board with your project. And then building partnerships with community, fulsome partnerships, requires a kind of creative thinking that's different than, just promote my film on social media. I don't know if that answers that first question. What do you think, Vanessa?
Yeah, I think this is always about who is in that production team as well, right? Even if it's the producer or even if it's the director, if they really feel like they have the energy to continue on with the campaign, then obviously they're welcome to. But most of the time what happens is that another person has to come in and continue that torch.
Exactly. So my short answer would be, if it is someone from the film team, they need to do a little bit of learning. And if it is someone coming to the project, I feel like that's most beneficial, but of course it requires more resources that the project may not have. What was the second question, Vanessa?
The second question was, how do you in Story Money Impact decide
select
to
our projects?
Get involved with these films?
So Story Money Impact is a relatively young organization. So the films that we have chosen to impact produce, we had relationships with because they came in through our Good Pitch Vancouver program, which is a program that has a call for applications. We read through all those applications, we accept them into our impact lab. We hold a good pitch event for them. You saw that video. And then of those projects, some of them chose to impact produce themselves. Some of them chose to do a marketing/impact campaign, which is very different. And some of them chose to hire us to be their impact producers, and we accepted. Sometimes filmmakers will approach us And depending on our workload, we may say yes, but usually it's because we see an urgent issue that with a quality film that has the potential to make that change. So I hope that answers your question. And I'm going to go right into strategy building. So part of the thinking is what's happening in that issue right now, because the issue about immigration and mental health when the film was being made might be different than what people are saying about mental health now. When Ying Wang, the director of The World is Bright, first started making The World is Bright, it took her 12 years. Even people in the mainstream, European settler Canadian society weren't really talking about mental health. But fast forward to like 2018, there are so many campaigns about mental health that there was a lot more support for those types of campaigns at that time. And so we understood that in Canadian society, there were people who were doing really great mental health work, and there were people who were doing really great immigration work. But at that time in 2018, nobody was working together to provide mental health care for immigrants, specifically for immigrants. So that was like a weak spot that we identified. So one of our tactics for reaching our first goal to create mental health awareness in immigrants was to create partnerships between immigrant NGOs and mental health NGOs so that they could help each other, right? Settlement agencies, which is what we call immigrant organizations in Canada, would basically tell mental health organizations the specific needs of immigrants. And then mental health organizations would create materials that immigrants could then, that settlement agencies could provide to immigrants in those settlement materials. So that was some of the thinking that went into that. The other thinking that you have to, and it's very hard to ask this question, is which of your goals are realistic? Because when you're mapping the issue, when you're understanding your film, when you're creating your goals, obviously you want to change the world and you want to like get into the Prime Minister's office and say, this will not stand. But the opportunity for that is quite low. And it takes a lot of relationships to get to the point where you can have that conversation with a government official, unless you're really good at setting meetings with government officials. So figuring out with your limited resources, what is the best way to mount your impact campaign is really important. I really think that impact producing, one of the key skills, one of the things that sets impact producing aside is that you're not really trying to screen the film for as many people as possible, right? That's what distributors do. What you're trying to do as an impact producer is you're trying to screen the film for the right people. So you may want, in a hypothetical situation where you could spend $5,000 on renting a venue and screening the film for 500 people, or spend $5,000 on, a month or 2 months salary for someone to keep emailing the same politicians over and over until they say yes to a meeting and then showing them the film. You might want to do the latter, even though the audience is smaller, the influence is larger. So that's kind of what I think about it as well. And I think it's also important during this process when you're building the strategy to think about how you take care of the protagonists of the film. I'm actually going to stop sharing screen for a moment because I think this is a really important topic. So in English, we call them documentary subjects, although we're trying to change the language to documentary participants or documentary protagonists. It's really important to acknowledge that these films are often capturing human beings at a very vulnerable time in their lives. They're either directly being affected by hardship at the moment that you are rolling your camera, or they're talking about an extremely vulnerable time in which they experience that hardship. And I guess I just want you to take a moment to imagine what it's like to, you know, in a very intimate setting, tell a camera your most vulnerable secrets about your life story, and then to have that story being shown on 100-foot silver screen for an audience of 200, 400 people. It's an extremely vulnerable moment. And if you as an impact producer or as a filmmaker decide that you want that protagonist to be a part of your impact campaign, you want them to come to film screenings and be a part of the discussion and talk about how making the film affected them or answer questions from the audience about their issues, you also have to spend an equivalent amount of energy in making sure that you protect them. For example, you know, for The World is Bright, these two parents, they spent 10 years mourning their son. And once they went back to China, they were really trying to move on. And they had spent too much time grieving already. And although they were interested in updates from the film, you know, when we requested, it was like, hey, so we're holding these screenings for the Legislative Assembly, we're holding this screening for these doctors, would you like to come and share your experience? We asked very gently because we knew that they didn't really want to think about it anymore. And, you know, they said, well, maybe, but what we heard was they didn't actually want to. So we just didn't push. We didn't want to reopen that wound for them. And I think giving your participants that power to say, I've participated in the project enough, our partnership ends here, is important. It's important not to pressure them to reopen those wounds. For Conviction, the film about prisons, I'll go even further back in the process. They knew that they were going to have an impact campaign. They knew they were going to screen the film and they were going to invite these participants in the film to be part of discussions. They had already agreed to this. But one of the inmates had a scene in the final cut of the film where she is in a bathroom stall injecting heroin into her toes after she just got out of prison. And she saw that scene in the movie and she said, I don't want people to see me like that. I don't want that to be the story that I have to address in every screening. And she said that if that scene stays in, I cannot be a part of your panel discussions. That would just be too triggering for me. I'm still struggling with addiction. And the filmmakers chose to cut that scene out because they wanted to honor that agreement with that protagonist to pay her to come out to these panels. So I think that's really important to just think about how the sharing of this story, like this story you made, if you are a filmmaker, this is your film, but the story doesn't necessarily belong to only you. And it's really important to be loving and gentle with the people who had the courage to share that story with you. So just a little thinking about taking care of your protagonists, particularly during an impact campaign. So I'm just going to go back to strategy building. Yeah, let's talk about mapping the issue. So I've talked already about how an impact campaign is all of these different people who are doing important work in their own sector. And part of your job as an impact producer is to figure out, okay, who's already doing the work, right? So I've got this film about mental health and immigration. Who's working with immigrants and who's providing mental health for the masses? And then you also want to think about who could be doing the work. So for example, for The World is Bright, we thought, okay, settlement agencies, mental health agencies, they can work together, but healthcare institutions who are referring their patients to these agencies, they should also be on board, because if they don't understand how to treat immigrants, that attitude is going to trickle down to everyone else who works within the healthcare sector. It's also really important to think about your ladder of engagement, right? Because you've chosen a ladder of engagement is here's the first thing you're going to ask your audience to do. And then once they start doing that, once they've given you their email, what's the next thing that you're going to ask them to do? And once they've shown that they're willing to do that, what's the next thing that you're going to ask them to do? So in the case of The World is Bright, the first thing that we did is we just held screenings. We showed people the film. We asked them to fill out a survey if they were interested in hosting a screening of the film. And then once some healthcare practitioners and immigrant workers and mental health care practitioners told us that they wanted to screen the film for their organization, we would then ask them, okay, can you now take a few meetings with these other organizations to talk about how you can work together? And once we helped organize those meetings, we started saying, hey, can we search for funding for this project for all of us to continue working together and actually make some of the conversations we've been having come true. And so having that idea of, okay, if I get them to do this, what's the next thing I can ask them to do? If I get them to do this, what's the next thing I can ask them to do? I think that's really important. Do we have any questions about strategy building, Vanessa?
No, there's just a comment that we're not seeing your screen.
Oh yeah, because I was just gonna be talking with one screen, and I'd rather you saw my face than just some text. Great. Well, then I'll move on to the next slide. So I'm going to show you this slide, and it's adapted a bit from a Doc Society graphic that I thought was so useful, which is of how the different puzzle pieces of society currently don't quite fit together, and the film could be the piece in the middle that brings them all together. So you don't have to read this whole thing, but it kind of shows you some of the thinking that I did to kind of build partnerships for different organizations. So for example, Kavana Keepers, it's a film about Indigenous land defenders. You saw a clip of it in the Good Pitch video. And it, you know, so much of the film takes place in northern British Columbia, a province in Canada that's very beautiful. It's full of mountains and lakes and forests. And we thought, how do we get people to care about this land? So we went to Patagonia, which is an organization that designs outdoor sportswear and outerwear. And we said, listen, you have this incredible audience of people who spend time in the very locations that we are trying to protect. Would you like to support this project about people who are protecting this land so that your customers can continue going to it and enjoying it and using your equipment? And they came in with $60,000. It was really wonderful. For The World is Bright, which is what we've been talking about this entire time, we brought in Mosaic, which is an organization, is the largest settlement agency in Canada. When a refugee arrives in Canada, Mosaic gives them resources for where to find ESL lessons, English as a second language lessons, where to buy clothing that's affordable, locations of places where they can get food, some financial support, childcare, after school activities, things like that. It's a really amazing organization, and they happily came on board. Success is one of the few organizations that specifically deals with mental health for immigrants, and simply their endorsement gave us so much capital, social capital in the community. We also brought in the Canadian Mental Health Association. And once we brought these organizations together, we laddered it up. We said, listen, we've got all of these people who do work in this issue, who believe in this film. And we went to Jane Thornthwaite, who is a politician, a provincial politician, who was the official opposition critic of the Ministry of Mental Health. And we said, look at all of these people who believe in the work that we're doing. Can you also support? And because we had all of this support, Jane Thornthwaite came on board. She watched the film. She thought it was so strong. She started talking about it in legislative assembly and making it a part of her toolkit for talking about mental health. So it's just, you can kind of see how these people all were separately doing their work, but our impact campaign brought them all together. So how do I erase this? There we go. Partnership building. So this one I really want to hear a lot of questions on because this is something I'm very passionate about. How do you actually build a partnership? Well, the first thing is you need to figure out everyone who's out there who's doing the work. And I know that I only named like 3 or 4 for The World is Bright, but I am not exaggerating when I tell you that I learned about hundreds of organizations that work on issues related to The World is Bright. I created this database, and I would just fill that database in with organizations I found through Google searches, just typing immigration British Columbia or immigration Canada or mental health and immigration or whatever. And I would read the news articles that came up. I would read the academic papers that came up. And every time they mentioned a person that seemed important or an organization that seemed important, I would just put it into the database. I also set up a Google alert so that anytime an article came up about those 2 issues, I would read it and then I would put it into the database. And the great thing about everything being on the internet nowadays is that you can go to their website and then you can see all of the organizations that they collaborate with to do their work and all the people who fund their work. And I took all of those organizations and I put them in the database. Then I went to their websites and I looked at all the organizations they worked with and all the organizations that funded their work, and I would put it into the database. And what eventually you see is something like this, right? A spreadsheet that has hundreds and hundreds of organizations, whether they're community organizations or public figures or experts and academics or politicians. You have them all in a list and you have this understanding of who's doing the work and how that you wouldn't have had before doing this research. And then the next step is often what I find to be the most intimidating step, which is outreach. So outreach is you call every single one of those contacts in your spreadsheet. You email every single one of them. You ask them for their help. You offer to help them with your film. You figure out a way for the 2 of you to work together. And this is where the strategy building and your understanding of the film and the issue is going to really become important, because you're having these 15-minute, 30-minute, 1-hour calls where you're trying to convince someone who's already very busy to help you. And you're going to get a lot of no's, but you just have to kind of keep asking. So I want to go through the steps that I went through for The World is Bright. The first thing is that the filmmaker, whether that's you or the person who hired the impact producer, is going to have existing relationships from making the film, the people that they interviewed, the organizations that they did research on. And I think it's great to add that to your spreadsheet and start conversations with them. And ask whether they can introduce you to other organizations, right? By now, because you've built your strategy, you know who you want to reach and what you want to tell them. You should have very specific ask. And being specific with your ask makes it easier for them to say yes or no. So if, for example, The World is Bright, we really wanted to show it to psychiatrists, to counselors, to psychologists, so that they would understand that when they had an immigrant, they had to understand that they've already gone through a lot of stress just to book that appointment. So we would go to some of the people that Ying interviewed in The World is Bright, and we said, hey, do you know any associations or provincial groups or working groups or email lists that we should talk to. And so they introduced us to them and so on and so forth. When you're starting a conversation with someone new, with someone who's never heard of your film, I think the important thing for me when I have that conversation is your first ask is very small and you're focusing on what the film can do for them, how the film can support them. So, for example, for The World is Bright, Mosaic was one of the largest settlement agencies in Canada. And Sherman Chan was our contact there, and he was the director of family services, and he's very busy all the time. So all I asked of him was like, can you show up to this meeting? That's all we're asking. We're not asking you to commit to financing our impact campaign. We're not asking you to commit to providing human resources to screen the film for your organization. We just want you to show up to this 1-hour meeting. And he showed up to the meeting and there were politicians there. There were other organizations that he felt competitive against. There were charities, there were big corporations. And he was so impressed by the level of people we had brought together that he said, oh, please let me continue supporting because it looks really good for me to be involved in this project. So I guess what I'm saying is outreach, when you're trying to develop partnership, is a lot like sales. You really have to focus on what that organization can get out of it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because ultimately you're contacting these organizations because you believe in the work that they do. I thought that Mosaic provided excellent support for immigrants in Canada. I just thought they needed to provide more mental health support. And I wanted to give them that by partnering them with the Canadian Mental Health Association. And I wanted to help them create that partnership by organizing screenings of this film where they could continue working with each other. So I would like to kind of actually take a moment to ask if there are any questions about outreach or any questions that I think we should answer.
There are a lot of questions actually, so I'm struggling to even like group them, but I'll give it a try. Here are a couple. So Angela Gomez asked and wants to know if, like related to designing and strategy, if you should share the film first with a small audience and then create an impact campaign. So that's one question. But if you want, I can tell you like a couple of questions and then.
No, I'll just quickly answer that. I think it's important to pilot everything that you do. You want to test and see if it's working the way that you think it will before you do it writ large. So I do think you should screen the film for a small audience of experts before you embark on your impact campaign. What's the next question?
So Elga Delgadillo asks, what stage is ideal, what stage of the filmmaking is ideal to start designing? If it's during development, production, and actually I'll connect that with a question from Priscila Andrade, which is about the possibility of a campaign for a film that has already been premiered and has been distributed, what some people may call like a shelf film, if it's also possible to do an impact campaign, you know, after it's been through apparently its whole cycle. So
Great.
These are both about when is the best time to design.
Totally, great questions. I'm actually going to stop sharing the screen for this question. So for the first question, the thing that I always say to filmmakers that approach Story, Money, Impact is that it's never too early to start thinking about impact, and it's never too late to start thinking about impact. The earlier you have an impact producer or someone who's thinking about how the film is going to be deployed, the more the activities of your impact campaign are going to affect the edit of the film to support that. Because we've seen films that, got all of these partners on board after, during post-production. And then once the film was finished, the partners were kind of like, oh, this is a bit longer and less impactful than we expected. And then we've also seen films where all of the partners came on board before the film was even edited. And then they actually changed the edit of the film to be more about the issue. And so it was more useful as a tool. So I always think it's the earlier an impact producer can start helping you think through the issues of your film and help you articulate what you're trying to do with it, the better. But one problem we always see is that if your film's not finished yet and you build all these partners, and then it takes another 3 years before your film is finally finished, and you go back to those partners, it's like, hey, that film is finished. And then those partners don't even, the people who championed you don't even work at those organizations anymore. It's almost like having to build all of those relationships again. It's like duplicating your work. So there's a sweet spot, I think, where you're building these partnerships so that they can support all of the energy around the premiere of your film. But that's not to say that off-the-shelf films can't be impact produced. So Story Money Impact is actually experimenting now with taking the films that have premiered in the past 6 years and seeing, can we mount an impact campaign off of films that did not have an opportunity to create impact? And we're just had a theatrical screening and then went into the archive. And I think it is possible, because as long as you find the right audience for whom that film is new, what does it matter that it premiered 6 years ago? As long as the people who are watching it find value in the information and the story that's being presented.
Totally. I think it can even give the films like a new wave years after they've been distributed, because some of the issues, right, they come back, or they're cyclical, or we see a new uprising that is similar to a case that occurred years ago or in some other place. So I think it's definitely relevant to think about like old films and see if an impact campaign can give them a new life.
Exactly.
There are some questions around, well, on the one hand, around like how you keep your relationships with the communities that are part of these films. And there are some questions about evaluation. So maybe we go first with, how do you work with communities and for them?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to table the questions about evaluation because I'll talk about that later. When I, as an impact producer, am working with communities, I give their voice equal power at the conversation, because normally their voices aren't really heard. And part of the impact campaign is that for conviction at least, is that the things that they experienced are actually really important evidence that should be taken into consideration when you're drafting policy that's going to affect their lives. So how people at Story Money Impact choose to work with community is to put them above the line. I don't know how that translates into Spanish, but essentially it means giving them actual tangible power over the film and the impact campaign. So naming them a producer or naming them an executive producer, paying them to be a consultant, and showing that you value their input in ways that are hard evidence and not just words. So for Klabana Keepers, of course, the community of land defenders have final approval over the edit of the film. And that's like really powerful, and it's really new. It's not necessarily right for every project, but it was right for this one because the filmmaker was not Indigenous. And so, had to avoid all appearances of being extractive. For conviction, we simply, we hired those women who are in the film. There are always plans to hire those women to be a part of the Impact campaign. And for The World is Bright, it's just always making sure that the people on our panels have lived experience with being an immigrant or being a child of immigrants, so that we just don't have white men talking about immigrant issues. So that's how I would say we work with community. I'm going to go back to the presentation because I know that we're at this time already. So I'm going to quickly talk about tools because I think this is going to be very helpful to everyone watching. If you are planning to do outreach for your film, here are some of the tools that I use regularly every day that I think are going to be very useful to you. Yet Another Mail Merge is a program that allows you to email many people at once while making it seem like a personal email. So what it does is that you take a Google spreadsheet and you fill in all the columns. And as you're writing the email, you can just drop in the name of the column in your email. So you can say, dear first name, I'm contacting you at organization because I think reason for contacting. I really love it if you could reach out to me because I want to talk to you about this specific, about blah, 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 blah. And it's a great way for you to be able to send out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails a day without having to write each one manually. I could not have been able to do my job without this program. Yet Another Mail Merge. It's very affordable. It's $40 Canadian per year. So it's one of the cheapest mail merge programs out there. I also use Calendly. So one thing about being an outreach director is that you're trying to find a time to call, to share calls with hundreds of people. And normally they won't just pick up the phone. They'll want to schedule a phone call with you. So it can take a lot of time and a lot of effort to go send 5 or 6 emails back and forth being like, are you available this time? What about this time? Oh, I got the time zone wrong. Can we do this time? Calendly is a appointment booking site where you just send them one link and they can choose to book a meeting of whatever length you have available with you within the time that you have available. And if you use Google Calendar, it syncs with your calendar so it doesn't allow people to book meetings when you have a meeting with someone else. So I use Calendly religiously. I send it out over and over and over again. And on some days, my outreach calendar is completely full from 8:30 a.m. all the way to 6 p.m., but no one overlaps and no one double books. So it's a very powerful tool. Boomerang is already a popular tool. Some of you may already know about it. Boomerang is a tool that allows you to schedule emails to go out if you haven't received a response. So I use it so that when I send someone an email following up with them, it's like, hey, I sent you this email. Have you read it? I'd love to set up a call with you. And then before they even respond, I write my second email being like, hey, it's been a week. I haven't heard from you. I'd really love to share that call with you. Can you please give me a call back or use my Calendly link? And then I set it to, if they don't respond, please send out this email. And this way I'm automating following up with contacts over and over again. Because the reality of it is when you're dealing with busy people who have jobs, you're going to have to email them like 3 or 4 times before they even read your initial email. The other tool I use almost every day is hunter.io. Some of you can check out that website right now, www.hunter.io. Nanny, if you want to drop that in the chat. It's a website where if you put in the URL of an organization's website, it will search the entire internet for people who have emails attached to that domain name. And it's really powerful for when you want to find someone specific at an organization, but they don't have any contact information on their website. It's a really powerful tool. I've used it to find specifically the community development person at an organization. I've used it to find the emails of executive directors. It's really great. Rocket Reach is a paid program. I don't highly recommend it, but it does the same thing. You can search someone's name and the organization, and usually it has a couple of options for phone numbers and email addresses. So I just want to put those tools in front of you. Yet Another Mail Merge, Calendly, Boomerang, Hunter.io, and Rocket Reach. So again, I want to go back to this screenshot of some of my spreadsheets. You'll see that it goes all the way down to 139, but I believe this spreadsheet had like 300 contacts in it, and not everyone is going to respond, and not everyone is going to be aligned with you. I guess why I wanted to show this again is I wanted to say that you're making an impact simply by doing this outreach, because as you call each of these organizations and you say, hey, I want to talk to you about mental health and how immigrants experience it, you're educating them on the issue. You're telling them that this is an issue that people care about, that a film is being made about it, that it's nuanced, and that all these different organizations are becoming a part of it, and that you would like them to be a part of it. So they're learning about that, but you're also learning, you're being educated as you do your outreach as well, because some of these community partners that you're contacting will actually have very strong opinions about the language that you're using, about the approach that you're taking. Some of them will tell you during a 15-minute phone call, it's like, oh, that's your impact goal? We tried that 5 years ago and it didn't work. Nobody cared. And honestly, that's really good feedback to get for free. And as I was doing a lot of these calls, I found that the language I used to talk about the issue got more and more strongly developed, so that I could hold my own as an impact producer who didn't have any formal training in psychiatry or in immigration law. I could hold my own in a conversation with a politician or with a psychiatric expert about, well, what about cultural competency? What about this thing? What about this thing? Which is in and of itself a really powerful tool. So even if you're doing your outreach and people are saying no and they're declining, it doesn't mean that it was a zero-sum interaction, because you are teaching them about an issue that you think is important, and you are learning about how they approach the issue. So I just want to quickly say that. So ultimately what happens is you have a group of people that you consider your partners, and what happened with The World is Bright is we got all of these partners, and not all of them stayed on. I think the reality of building partnerships with a film is that you don't have to say yes to everything that they offer, right? We had the University of Alberta offer to write a grant to help us study how international students are affected by mental health challenges. And that was something we were really excited about. But we realized that working in academia really distracted from our main goal of building partnerships between service organizations. So ultimately we said, maybe in a couple of years, but not now. Kickstarter came to our organization and said, hey, if you want to crowdfund money, then we will give you a special place in our newsletter. We'll give you a special place on our website, and hopefully that'll help you raise more money. And we seriously considered that when we were searching for funding, but we realized that crowdfunding, even on Kickstarter, even with the support of Kickstarter, is still a really big job, a full-time job with all the social media updates, with all of the copywriting, with all of the accounting that has to go on. And we ultimately decided that we didn't have the capacity to do that. So just to be honest about, even if you're very successful in building many partnerships, not all of them are going to work out, even if you want them to. Like, for example, the InSpirit Foundation came to our meeting, and they said, we'd we want to explore pledging a certain amount of money to help your campaign. But then when we went to them, they really wanted to see whether how the film resonated with audiences before they would commit any funding. So we still needed to search for funding. So let's talk about fundraising. This is a really tough subject because fundraising is super hard. When you build a budget, I think it is good to dream big. I think it is good to think about your international campaign, your global campaign, your, a team of 5 people who can work on this full-time year-round. For The World is Bright, we wanted to screen the film not just in Canada, not just in Vancouver, but also Toronto, also Montreal, where all the immigrants are. But we also wanted to bring it to the US. We wanted to bring it to China and address the issue in that country. We wanted to put this film in ESL classrooms and design ESL lesson plans. We wanted to constantly be bringing new partners to the table to join a network, an association of people who are working on this specific issue. But the fact of the matter is that, a campaign like that costs millions of dollars. And if you are having trouble finding funding, know that you're not alone, right? We had a lot of trouble fundraising for The World is Bright. So what we ended up doing is that we looked at all the things that we wanted to do, and we cut out the pieces that we thought we had to do, and the pieces that we thought we could make the most impact in right away. So earlier on, when we were mapping the issue and building the strategy, we already identified that changing the law was going to be incredibly difficult. We already knew that reforming the border police was going to be quite difficult. And so we decided, okay, what if we built the campaign around only building mental health awareness and competence in the immigrant community? And so we built a campaign around that. And we went to our partners and we said, we just need a small amount of money to bring this film to immigrants, to prove that it has an impact. And then we're going to use that evidence to look for more funding, because they'll see that it's actually a proven project. So the Canadian Mental Health Association committed 5,000 Canadian dollars. So 5,000 Canadian dollars is like less than 5,000 US dollars, if that makes things easier. It's not a lot of money at all. But what we did is we decided not to spend that money right away. We used that money and went back to another couple of community organizations and said, hey, this organization gave us $5,000. Can you give us like 2,000? Can you give us 3,000? And then we got enough money to hold 4 screenings for a pilot impact campaign. And we held those 4 screenings, and I'm going to talk about that with the next slide. And we evaluated the hell out of those 4 screenings. We tracked how many people watched the film. We tracked how people felt before the film. We tracked how people felt after the film. We recorded people's thoughts right after they watched the film. We held meetings with the partners right after the film. And then we took all of that evidence from those 4 screenings, and it wasn't a lot. It was like 10 pages of quantitative and qualitative feedback. And we went to the InSpirit Foundation. We said, hey, this is what we did with 4 screenings. What do you think about funding us now? And then they gave us another $10,000, and we went and we held another 8 screenings. And often, with the other, even with Conviction and some of the other films that we've worked on, even though it's ideal that we get all of our money at once and we can just go on this amazing campaign and work full time on it, oftentimes you'll have to take a phased approach. You do your pilot, and then you change it a little bit, and then you do another pilot, and you build your relationships with your funders so that they're more and more confident in you. And the entire time as you're gathering this data, you can also be applying for grants from public funds or to foundations. So that's what I'll say about The World is Bright with funding, but I just want to wish everyone good luck, because I know it's always very tough. as important as it is to believe in your work, it's also important to be able to survive and be paid for your work. So I do hope that everyone believes everyone has success with their search for funding. So I'm going to go into execution, but Vanessa, should we take a couple of more questions before I dive into this?
Yes, let's do a couple of questions. So for fundraising, since you just touched on that, they were asking, what exactly can you ask when you're fundraising with to a partner, right? Like, is it the salary of an impact producer? Is it the honorariums for the protagonists that are part of the campaign? Is it the fees for screening? What kind of things have you gotten a budget for these campaigns? And I think you already touched a little bit on how you've been measuring impact, but Edith was also asking whether you worked with psychologists for your impact campaign with The World is Bright, also to protect your film participants, and how did you measure the impact for them, for the film participants?
Yeah, great questions all. So let's tackle the funding question. So every funder is different. Some funders will fund salaries, some funders won't. And part of the unfortunate necessary work is to do the balancing in your budget to make sure that all items are accounted for. We were lucky with The World is Bright in that InSpirit Foundation and the Canadian Mental Health Association, because they didn't put a lot of restrictions on what we could spend money on. So we mostly partitioned it out to license fees for the use of the film, because the filmmaker absolutely needs to be paid and supported for the work that they put into the film. And then fees for all of the panelists, because they need to be paid for their expertise and their work. And then fees for the impact producer. And then we had different budget items also for the website, translation, social media, things like that. There are, with Conviction, they got a $15,000 grant from Lush Cosmetics. I don't know if you have Lush Cosmetics. No?
We don't.
Okay, no. They're a soap company, but they care very much about social justice. But they put a lot of restrictions on their grant. We couldn't use that money to pay salaries. We couldn't use that money to pay for food that was not vegan. We couldn't use that money to pay for any carbon emissions whatsoever, or anything that led to carbon emissions, which is quite restrictive. I'm trying to think of something that doesn't fall into those buckets right now, and it's very hard. We ate at a lot of vegan restaurants during that campaign. So what we ended up doing with Conviction is that we used that money to provide vegan catering for all of the events. We used it to pay for posters and event materials, the cost of printing them. But then we used funding from our donations to pay for things that we needed more leverage over. And we used funding from a grant to pay the salaries. So I hope that answers your question. The question about psychologists, yes, we absolutely worked with multiple psychiatrists and counselors that have lived experience as immigrants or working with immigrants to help us design how we were going to frame our panels, how we were going to write our discussion guide. They were there with us every step of the way. For example, as an impact producer, one of my first thoughts was, I would love for people in the audience who have a personal story about a mental health challenge that they had to share that story in a safe space. Because I thought, we just want people comfortable talking about that. And then I had 3 psychiatrists say, that is a terrible idea. Do not do that. You're going to trigger them. You're going to trigger other people in the audience. You don't have the training to make it a safe clinical space. People should not be free to share their personal anecdotes, and they should be stopped from sharing their anecdotes. And I was like, cool, you're the expert, I'm gonna listen to you. And when we were writing our discussion guide, we were using a lot of accessible language so that people would understand, no matter what level of English they were at. But we put it through the same psychiatrist and they said the same thing. It's like, hey, you have to not phrase it this way because it's problematic. So having those experts consult is really, really important. Yeah, especially since they were immigrants themselves. So they were providing feedback in two ways. And the last question was about measuring.
I'm just gonna add, and also to give Leonardo a bit of a break, I'm gonna just add to that in Spanish. En cuanto a lo que se puede financiar a veces con un presupuesto de impacto, pues hay cosas como estas que estaba diciendo Anthony, de tener quizás expertos en otras materias que puedan consultar para los materiales, para las discusiones, para los eventos que hacemos. En el caso de él, pues estaba hablando de los psicólogos. En México también, con una película que era sobre salud mental, lo que hacíamos para poder abrir estos espacios del público en el que a veces inevitablemente pues salen historias personales, era que siempre nos acompañaba una organización de salud mental que podía después de alguna forma como, digamos, que rodear a estas personas o también, digamos, ofrecerles sus servicios de alguna manera. Y a veces los presupuestos de impacto, si bien algunos no van a permitir salarios, sí pueden permitir el pago de este tipo de consultorías. Entonces eso solo como para dar algunos ejemplos. And then now back to you about, yeah, just maybe if you can share a little bit more on evaluation and how you, like particularly how you evaluate the impact in the lives of the communities or the participants of the film.
Yeah, I'm going to table that because there's a specific slide that I want to talk about the evaluation. I want to talk about execution first. So I will get to that question. Don't worry. It's very important to me. How are we doing for time?
So we have about 10 minutes left.
10 minutes left. Okay. All right, then. Let's share this screen. So executing. So with Conviction, and The World is Bright, they both had robust film festival runs. They played at many different film festivals. With Conviction, they decided to use their impact resources, their funding, to support their festival screenings because they thought, okay, we already have 500 people here or 200 people here. Let's try and change their minds. With The World is Bright, I chose to not do that because what we found with Conviction is that the people who attend film festivals to watch your film usually already agree with the issue in some way. And film festivals screenings are often under the control of the festival itself. So the film festival will tell you how long the Q&A should be. The film festival will tell you who is the moderator and what questions that they're going to ask. And a good impact screening, I think the impact producer has to have more control over what questions are being asked, what's the topic of discussion, and how long it lasts. So with Conviction, many of the discussions were only 20, 30 minutes long, even if they had a senator there. But The World is Bright, we regularly had 90-minute, 2-hour-long discussions that were really robust. So a phased approach, I talked a little bit about that on my previous slide. If you are having trouble filling out your budget to be able to do all the things you do, think about how you can divide up the different things you want to do so that one leads to the other, so that one can prove that your project is worthy of funding, and then you can fund the next approach. For example, for The World is Bright, I talked a little bit about wanting to use the film in ESL classrooms, English as a second language classrooms in Canada. And during the campaign, we just didn't have the resources to make that happen. But during the first phase of the campaign, we invited many ESL educators to our screenings to see the film, and we put aside $1,000 to develop the lesson plan that ESL teachers could use in their classrooms. And so now those things exist, our relationships with ESL teachers and the tool that we want to give ESL teachers to implement this film in their classroom. So we're now in the process of having a conversation about the next phase of our campaign, which is to go directly to the contacts that we already have, give them the tools that we already made, and organize all of these screenings at schools all across Canada. And it's much easier for our funder to say yes, because we've proven that we can do this, and we've shown evidence that we're prepared to do this next phase. And of course, once this is during this phase, we're going to start inviting politicians to some of those screenings. And then our next phase is hopefully doing a screening in various provincial legislative assemblies. So division of labor. This one is tough because it will be different for every film team and who is on each film team, and that's who does what. The very first Impact Lab I ever attended at Good Pitch Europe, there was this amazing conversation between two impact producers about who should organize the screenings. And one very senior person said, the impact producer should not organize the screenings. The impact producer creates the strategy, develops the partnerships, but the distributor should organize the screenings because the distributor should be paid to do that. And the other impact producer, who's a very prolific impact producer, said, well, no, I book the venue, I put butts in seats, I work with the distributor and they help, but they don't care as much about the screening as I do. So I want to make sure that those screenings are healthy because I care about the issue, whereas the distributor only cares about how many tickets they sell. And I think it's a really powerful argument. With Conviction, we have the National Film Board is the distributor. And I have to tell you, it was a lot easier to have a distributor organize screenings because it's a whole big piece of logistical work that I don't have to spend time on. However, I felt unfulfilled by some of those discussions because you know, maybe they were too short, or maybe the moderator wasn't asking the right questions, or maybe the venue did not allow us to hand out our surveys, which you know, robbed us of the opportunity to measure our impact. And then with The World is Bright, I organized every screening. I picked the venue. I created the panel, I did the audience development, I brought in more people to watch the film, I did all the follow-up, and I did all of the evaluation analysis. And it was a lot of work. I was very stressed, but I feel very proud of those screenings. So it's kind of give and take. You have to be realistic about the amount of work that you can do. And I think that leads into my next point, which is virtual versus venue. So I think it's important for me to say that the World is Bright screening was entirely virtual. So I was organizing these screenings on Eventbrite to sell tickets. And then I would hold the screenings on Zoom, where we had a tech team just like this one at DocGo. And so that took out some of the stress of having to book a venue, pay for insurance, all of that stuff. Obviously, as we move towards a future where all of us are vaccinated and can begin to gather again, people will always prefer venue screenings. But I think there's a conversation to be had, and I'm not the expert on it right now, about continuing to hold virtual screenings so that they're accessible, so that they can fit into a professional's working day more easily because they can just tune in from their office, and the kind of access that it creates that having a live venue does not. Connecting everything to the impact goals. Basically, you're going to have so many different challenges. You're going to have friction with your different partners. You're going to have friction with your venues. You know, people are going to drop out. People are going to pressure you to put someone on the panel that you don't believe belongs there. I can't begin to list the number of things that can just be difficult when you're working with so many different people and you're trying to make it easy for everyone. And I guess what was always the guiding light for me is I would just ask myself, is this helping our audience? Is this helping us reach our impact goal, or is it hindering us from reaching our impact goal? And it was easy for me to make that decision. You know, for example, there was a great community partner who could have given us access to like thousands of audience members, but they weren't comfortable with us talking about the component of our discussion where we talk about racism in mental health care, because they felt like that would alienate their audience that was made up of mental health practitioners. And we just kind of thought like, and it was so risky for us to say, no, we absolutely have to talk about this. If we can't talk about it, we're going to walk away. But if we're not addressing the issue, why are we here? If we're not trying to fix the problem, why are we here? This audience, this screening will make my report look so much better to my funder. But how can I put that above the issue that I claim to care about? So I just want to say that it was very helpful for me to always be thinking, how do I help the people I'm trying to help? Not how do I ensure the success of this project, which I think are two very different things. And community partners, there's so much to talk about community partners, but I will simply say that some community partners will be very engaged and very helpful. Some community partners will be an employee that got stuck with you because of an order their boss gave them. And I think understanding the difference makes working with each easier. The mistake that I see a lot of early career impact producers make is that when they're very early on in discussing whether or not you should hold a screening, is that they list all the things they expect the community partner to do. And I think that's a mistake because it's going to scare them off. They're going to look at this like, oh, I don't have time for this. I have to run this program. I have to run this program. I have to fundraise. I have to do this, blah, 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 blah. Again, it's a ladder of engagement. You ask them, it's like, hey, you know, if you do this, I'll be able to, the distributor will sell tickets. The distributor will handle setting up the screening link. I'm going to give you all of these materials to share on social media. All you really need to do is send this email. And then they agree. And then, of course, you continue that conversation. And then you say, hey, you already sent out that email, but only X people signed up. Can you do a little bit more development? And they've already committed, so it's easier to ask them for more and more. So I think it's just about being careful, not being understanding that every community organization is also doing the work that you think is important in addition to helping you with your project. And that'll give you more success in that community. I want to talk about evaluation, but do we have a quick question about execution? Vanessa?
No, I think we're running out of time, unfortunately.
Okay, well, let's talk about, are we out of time or are we running out of time?
I think this is the last topic that we can cover very quickly, because a lot of people wanted to know about evaluation.
Great. So quantitative data versus qualitative data. Let's talk about it. Quantitative data is you being able to say 60% of people were able to do this. And we raised 16 million, feedback answers or petition or whatever like that, things that you can count. And those are really impressive pieces of data that show the breadth of your campaign. And I know that impact producers and the whole sector loves quantitative data because it's measurable. And I do too, but I think it's important to not dismiss qualitative data, which is someone writing you a letter about how the film affected them, or a story of what happened at a screening. So for The World is Bright, I can say that 60% of the people who attended our screenings were immigrants, which is really great. It shows we successfully reached the audience we were going for. But the story I love to tell to funders is, one time we were holding a screening for 200 immigrants at a public library. And everyone in that screening was angry at us because they did not feel like their community had a problem with mental health. They felt like the film was actually about legal injustice, and they were upset that we would say that they don't talk about mental health or that they have a mental health stigma problem. And then we just kept talking. We used our discussion guide to create a safe space. We said, well, you don't think that there's a mental health problem in your community, but if you look at the film, the protagonist's family didn't know about his mental illness until he committed suicide. So if you had asked them if they had a mental health problem in their family, they would have said no. So don't you think that it's just better for us to be able to talk about these things to reduce the risk of us losing our loved ones or not helping them when they need us most? And then by the end of the screening, everyone was asking for more resources. And to me, that was one of the most beautiful things, to see an angry mob turn into a supportive audience. And it showed me the power of this film. Evaluation will also tell you whether what you're doing is working. So I want to tell that story about conviction one more time. We were screening the film, and then all the surveys that were coming back were telling us that people already agreed with the film. So we knew that we weren't showing it to the right people. So we had to pivot right in the middle and show it to more conservative audiences. We had to tell all the partners, like, hey, I know we organize all these screenings. We had plans to organize these screenings, but we don't think it's the best use of our resources. We have to go to different partners, because we'll still give you the film, but we'll have to spend our resources organizing discussions somewhere else. And the great thing about evaluation is that it helps you with your reporting. I've already talked about reporting to your funders. And when you look at your reports, it's going to support your future campaign design, right? It wasn't until we were looking through our report that we realized that we actually screened the film for a lot of ESL educators, and that should be the next phase of our campaign. So making sure that everything that you do is written down, is measured, and collected in one place is just so useful. And so I just want to quickly show you what our evaluation form looked like. We printed these out. We just put them on every seat. And not only could people mark it with a pen that they had, they could just tear. And it would just tell us whether they were an immigrant or they weren't. We would ask them about their knowledge before the screening, and then we would ask them to fill out the rest of it after the screening, and then we would measure the difference. And these were paper surveys. And I think the important thing to note when you're designing a survey like this is that you want to be as neutral as possible if you want accurate answers. I know there's a big temptation to design a survey so that you get the answers you want. But again, You want accurate answers so that you can better serve the issue, as opposed to ensuring the success of your project. So this is what our survey looked like. We translated it into Chinese for our Chinese screenings. And just a quick learning, we did print these out. It is easier to get people to fill out a paper survey, but that means you have to put those surveys into a spreadsheet. So it's best if you just create a Google form and use that instead, and then it's much easier for you to measure that data after. So for The World is Bright, we're able to say that 60% of our attendees were immigrants. 35% of them had mental health challenges and 81% knew someone who did. 34% drastically changed in their knowledge about mental health issues. 43% drastically changed their willingness to talk about mental health. And 98% of surveys would take further steps to becoming more competent with mental health conversations. And, you know, we have to trust the surveys, but how we got that information is, for example, we wanted them to rate their knowledge before they heard about The World is Bright. And if they marked 1 and on before, and then they marked 5 on after, then we knew that we had completely changed their mind on the topic. And that is one of the most impressive stats that we were able to show to our funders. So that's it. I do want to call out quickly, thank you to, DOCO and to the impact guide that Doc Society, a different organization, makes. It's taught me so much. I encourage you all to check it out. It's 237 pages. It's available in Espanol. So please take a look through it for deeper information. Go ahead, Vanessa.
Bueno, I'm going to go to Spanish. Sorry. Bueno, yo sé que nos pasamos un poco de la hora, así que agradezco a quienes se quedaron hasta el final. Creo que igual valía la pena extendernos estos minutos, pues la parte de la evaluación también es una gran pregunta y siempre nos quedamos cortas de tiempo. Pero creo que hoy con Anthony pues pudimos tener un recorrido bastante extenso y profundo de detalles de estas campañas que nos pueden dar luces a nosotras para las nuestras y para los diferentes frentes que estamos pues, empezando a enfrentar. Sé que más de una persona, por lo menos 2 personas me preguntaron por los poemas que se leyeron al principio, entonces acá los voy a compartir en el chat. Y quería también invitarles a que continuemos este tipo de conversaciones y de comunidad en el grupo que tenemos de acción, de la red de acción en Facebook. Nadine ahora va a compartir el link en el chat para quienes estén interesados e interesadas en unirse a ese grupo. Es un grupo cerrado, pero donde podemos continuar hablando de estas cosas porque siempre van a quedar preguntas, nunca nos alcanza el tiempo. Y también para que se sigan enterando de otras oportunidades, de otros eventos como este que esperamos poder seguir haciendo. Y también una pregunta que nos han hecho mucho es si vamos a poder compartir esta grabación. Sí, la masterclass está siendo grabada, entonces si nos dan un tiempito, somos un equipo muy, muy pequeño, pero con mucho corazón, entonces apenas podamos procesar las 2 clases, las estaremos enviando las grabaciones a sus emails con los que se inscribieron a estas charlas. Entonces ahí veo que están llegando muchas notas de agradecimiento, así que nada, pues espero que este haya sido un espacio valioso en medio de esta tormenta y nada, gracias por acompañarnos, un abrazo y thank you very much, Anthony, I wish you could hear what I just said in my closing remarks, but this was really, really valuable. And thank you for sharing so generously all your experiences and for bringing your energy into this space. Gracias también a Leonardo por ser increíblemente talentoso en la interpretación, y al equipo de Doco, a Marcela, a Tatiana, a Nadine, a Camila, por hacer esto posible. Un abrazo y buenas noches.